GreySheeters Anonymous started as part of Overeaters Anonymous, and Overeaters Anonymous was started on January 19th, 1960 by Roseanne S. in California. And over the next 15 years, the growing group defined abstinence differently as they worked through what it took to achieve peace or serenity with their food. In the beginning, the first definition was that abstinence was anything less than 2,000 calories per day. Then they went to 3 moderate meals with nothing in between except no-calorie beverages. In 1963, we had the first introduction of written down food plans. Some people remember the gold sheet that had no refined carbohydrates, and the green sheet for vegetarians. In 1966, the Overeaters Anonymous published a pamphlet for newcomers, and they went back to defining abstinence as a simple statement: 3 meals, 3 moderate meals with nothing in between, and avoiding our individual binge foods. In the late 1960s, the first GreySheet was written. It was not originated by Overeaters Anonymous officially. It was by members of the fellowship. And it wrote down that we would completely abstain from man-made sugars and starches and any foods with more than 10% carbohydrates. In 1972, OA adopted 3 of the food plans officially and published them together. At that time, the GreySheet was the most popular. It was the most common food plan. In 1977, we got another one called the Blue Sheet. In 1979, OA added even more food plans, and we had 8 food plans published in a pamphlet called Dignity of Choice. While all this was happening in Overeaters Anonymous around the world, in 1977, 2 members of Overeaters Anonymous who were using the GreySheet decided to start a meeting just for people using the GreySheet. It was the first GreySheeters meeting ever. And it was started in this church, First Church Cambridge, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So that is why we sometimes refer to the GreySheet as the Cambridge GreySheet, because we use the version of the GreySheet food plan that Sally and George used in 1977. The years went by. People reacted to there being meetings for GreySheet. The GreySheet community expanded, and they had to develop strategies to defend themselves because Overeaters Anonymous became more and more hostile to food plans. In 1986, Overeaters Anonymous officially withdrew all food plans and requested that all groups mail back their supplies of GreySheets to the OA office in Arizona. Attorneys started sending letters to groups that continued to use the GreySheet, saying that they would sue them if they didn't stop using the GreySheet. And different members of Overeaters Anonymous used to come to the GreySheet meetings and harass those people who were using the GreySheet. They would interrupt them when they were speaking. They would grab all the GreySheets off the table and run out of the room. They would raise their hand to speak and then criticize the GreySheet and tell people that they were breaking tradition and breaking the law. So it became important for the GreySheet community to be clear about who was abstinent and who wasn't, and what was acceptable in a GreySheet meeting. So the first GreySheet group purpose was written, and they used to read it at the beginning of the meeting. And you've all heard it. That's the purpose that says, this group of Overeaters Anonymous has been founded and designed to discuss the fundamentals or basics of attaining and maintaining GreySheet abstinence. For that purpose, we explore together the utilization of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous in arresting compulsive eating. We strongly support GreySheet. We require that our meeting leaders be abstinent for at least 3 months on the GreySheet. We support a vigorous and positive attitude toward GreySheet abstinence, which we define as 3 weighed and measured meals a day from the GreySheet, with nothing in between but black coffee, tea, and diet soda. And it was at this time that the founders of the GreySheet group in Cambridge took the GreySheet and made it even more specific than it already was. So where it says 2 of something, they put in an actual weight instead of 2 hot dogs, 2 pieces, they put in 4 ounces. Instead of a pat of butter, they put in half an ounce. So they started to make it even more precise to come closer and closer to Alcoholics Anonymous definition of sobriety. The other thing that the early GreySheet group did was they didn't use any of the OA signs and wall hangings and OA documents that would be in an OA meeting. They only used one large sign that said, "Don't eat no matter what." GreySheeters at these meetings started before, well, let me say, the leaders were careful who they called on to share in the meetings. So the people who were doing the GreySheet started saying some version of the mantra when they spoke to make clear who was and who was not doing GreySheet. I weigh and measure 3 meals a day from the GreySheet, write them down, commit them to a GreySheet sponsor. I don't eat no matter what. And my abstinence is the most important thing in my life without exception. So no matter what and without exception became part of our founding principles. Those early members in the 1970s, well, in the 1980s, they wrote down some of the things that were unique about their meetings. They all had a qualification format. So they all started with a member telling their story, and all the people who spoke told their story had to have at least 90 days of back-to-back abstinence. Then the leader would call on people to share, as opposed to people just speaking up and sharing spontaneously. The leader would call on people who were known to be securely abstinent and who shared the GreySheet message. They didn't call on people who were struggling until last during the meeting. They emphasized that the meeting was for positive pitches on GreySheet abstinence. It was about the food, the food, the food. It wasn't about your feelings. It wasn't group therapy. They decided that they would avoid mentioning foods by name. And they set the precedent that we would always acknowledge or celebrate all those people counting days up to 90 days. All gray sheet meetings remained open. Anybody interested in abstinence in the gray sheet solution was welcome. And all gray sheet meetings used Alcoholics Anonymous literature, not OA literature. So one of the founders, George, wrote a personal description of what he felt gray sheet abstinence was like. He said, "Our food is restored to us. We are not running away from food. We are not trying to achieve neutrality with food. We're not afraid of food. We get to enjoy our food. We insist on enjoying our meals. This is where we talk about having meals that are number 10, the best. We eat like queens and like kings. We have the best meals, the biggest and the best. Our meals are 3 daily celebrations, 3 times in the day when we stop working our recovery program, trying to be a better person, trying to be maximum usefulness, and we stop and we take time for ourselves to enjoy our meals. So this approach to abstinence and recovery was very successful and popular. By 1995, there were meetings every day in Boston, Beverly, Cambridge, and Martha's Vineyard, all towns in Massachusetts. There were weekly meetings in other small towns in Massachusetts. In the early 1980s, the first New York Gray Sheet meeting started here. It was started by Val from Cambridge, and she started in this church, the Yanhus Presbyterian Church, which many Gray Sheeters still remember. By 1995 in New York, there were over 3 meetings a day just in Manhattan. And this, remember, in the 1990s was before Zoom. These were people who were driving or taking the subway or walking to these meetings, and people were going to 3 meetings a day. There were daily meetings in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Long Island, and Queens, all over New York. By 1998, there were 128 groups around the world, many of them in the United States, California, Washington, Florida, all over the United States. But there were also meetings in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, London, Paris, Toronto, Puerto Rico, St. Croix, and Sweden. In fact, if you look at the printed meeting list for meetings around the world in 1995 was 5 pages long. Some other developments in the 1990s. Remember, we were still part of Overeaters Anonymous, and we were still separated around the world. There were no Zoom meetings, there was no internet, there were no WhatsApp calls. So each of these communities were doing these things to support their own members. In New York, they formed an organization called the Shades of Grey, and they published a quarterly newsletter, which they printed on paper and put it in the post mail and sent it out across the United States and across the world. In 1990, they started the first annual New York Roundup, and that roundup in New York is still the biggest gathering of Gray Sheeters every year and has been going ever since 1990. In 1994, we started the first email group for Gray Sheeters. In 1997, we started the phone meetings in the United States. And in 1998, we launched the GreySheeters website. While all that was happening in the 1990s, different cities around the world were having gatherings, roundups, one-day gatherings where people would come together and eat their meals together and have meetings all day long, and then retreats where people would go somewhere special for the weekend and spend the whole weekend staying together and eating together. In the 1990s, the New York GreySheeters surveyed everybody they could reach around the world and said, do you want us to form a special intergroup inside of OA to support people doing GreySheet? And overwhelmingly, people said, yes, we do. So the New York GreySheeters wrote to Overeaters Anonymous World Services and asked if we could start an intergroup, and they said no. They said, we are going to sue you if you don't stop distributing the GreySheet. You have no right to the GreySheet. So the group decided we would form a new fellowship separate from Overeaters Anonymous. And this was very controversial within the GreySheet community because many of us were part of OA, and that's how people found us. And we didn't know what was going to happen when we separated. But in 1998, we incorporated as GreySheeters Anonymous World Services. We became a separate 12-step fellowship with a board of trustees, and our vision, our purpose was to support GreySheeters around the world to carry the message, to support us in our abstinence, and to carry the message to other other compulsive eaters. So the board of trustees was formed, and the primary role that we decided that World Services would have is to protect the integrity of the GreySheet. And what we mean by that is the original food plan will never be changed, because none of us wants to be in the position to make decisions about the food. We all want to surrender. And so we all surrender to the original GreySheet food plan as interpreted by our sponsors. So our sponsors still sit down with us 25 years later and explain how we use the original GreySheet. But I had said that OA was threatening us. So we spent the next 10 years negotiating with Overeaters Anonymous, hiring an attorney, raising money to pay the lawyer, to negotiate with Overeaters Anonymous so that they would sell us the right to continue to use the GreySheet. And finally, after 10 years, we purchased the GreySheet and registered our own copyright. Since then, we've been able to build up our own organization. We have a structure of our own fellowship, which, like all other 12-step fellowships, starts with groups at the top. Each group is a collection of GreySheeters who come together to support each other in their abstinence and carry the message, mostly by holding meetings. So today we have 124 groups with 215 meetings. And the groups organize themselves into intergroups that share common features, like the Israeli intergroup, where everybody is in Israel and speaks Hebrew, or the Icelandic intergroup, where everybody is in Iceland and speaks Icelandic. And then we all come together once a year as the World Service Conference to make decisions about things that affect everybody all around the world. And it is the job of the Board of Trustees to implement those decisions. What have we done since we organized? We've printed and distributed the GreySheet in English and Spanish. We have a website to carry the information about meetings and events and literature. We have literature. We have 2 books. We are about to publish them in Spanish. We have a phone list that everybody is welcome to join on the website. It's available on the website, and it's secure. We provide a list of contacts in all areas around the world. We have a Facebook group, of which Ofer is a huge part. We have a podcast. We provide guidance to groups on difficult situations like personal safety, how to pay to rent a facility to have their meetings, how to organize themselves into intergroups. And every 5 years, we count ourselves around the world to find out how many GreySheeters are out there.